Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name is Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs, one of 5 regional centers throughout Wisconsin. The Southern Regional Center tries to keep an eye on 14 counties in southern and southwest Wisconsin, but we know these days borders are borders between the counties. They're real, but yet sometimes we have families that are living in a city that is part of 2 different counties. And so how real are they? Families live where they live and they have to deal with those rules and their regulations. So the 14 counties is just a way to say welcome. If you're in those counties, great. If you're not, welcome. We're glad you're here, especially today, because Hugh Davis and Wisconsin Family Times definitely does not sit just in the 14 counties in the southern region, but they are a statewide parent-led organization that is centered on supporting families who have children who are dealing with, who are working through, who are impacted by mental health challenges. And as you can tell, language is hard. And so we're going to possibly have some hard language today, but we're going to do our best because Hugh's been at this a little while. So Hugh, first of all, welcome and tell us a little bit more about Wisconsin Family Ties.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for pointing out that I'm old. When you say I've been at this for a while.
I meant to just say in my cohort. Is that better? That way,
that's fine.
Whatever they want.
I've come to grips with that.
I am embracing my aches and pains.
Yes, me as well. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, and you're taking a big risk having me unscripted. Usually when I'm unscripted, I'll say something that shocks someone. So we can probably expect that sometime during the time we have together today. So let me tell you a little bit about Wisconsin Family Ties. And to do that, I actually have to go back and talk a little bit about how we came to be. So Wisconsin Family Ties has been around now for 36 years, and it was formed from several parent support groups from around the state that came together after some organizing activity by the state, came together in Wisconsin Rapids over a weekend and decided to form a statewide organization. And so we have a very kind of grassroots beginning. It's hard to get more grassroots than parent support groups. And so one of the unique aspects about us that has continued throughout the nearly 4 decades of work is that we hire parents. We hire parents of the target population that we serve. And that makes us, somewhat unique in that we are able to build quick connections with the families that we serve, because while we haven't walked in their shoes, we've walked in pretty similar shoes. And that allows us to have a level of understanding, a depth of understanding that sometimes these parents aren't experiencing with other helping professions. So let me talk a little bit about the population that we serve. So Tim mentioned in the beginning that we're focused on children's mental health, and that's kind of a generic term for us. We actually cast a pretty wide net. So we refer to the population that we're looking to serve are families that include children with social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health challenges. We don't require any particular diagnosis. And when we say children, that's from birth through young adulthood. So it's a pretty broad range of kids, and again, a pretty broad range of the diagnoses that they may or may not even have. So again, pretty wide net. The work that we do it can be probably encapsulated by just saying that we help families get their needs met. our theory of working is that we believe that families who have kids who have some of these challenges are normal, healthy families, but they're facing extraordinary circumstances. And so for us, what we want to do, the theory is that if they have the right kinds of information, support, and resources available to them, they're going to thrive. There's no reason why they can't. Unfortunately, our society, our systems are not oriented towards that kind of support. That's the kind of gap that we fill, is to make sure that we try to get that kind of support, that kind of information to these families as soon as possible. As you know, just like any illness, a mental illness, any kind of illness, the earlier you intervene, the better the outcomes. And so the earlier that we can work with families to help them understand steps that they can take, the better things are, the better their whole ability to cope is, the better the services that their kids get, the better the outcomes for both the kids and families.
So can I just, I'm going to go ahead and insert here, just because I just got slots on my mind today, Hugh. And one of the things that you mentioned is this whole sense of, there's still this gap. And I have been knowledgeable about and trying to work alongside of Wisconsin Family Ties for 14 years. And in that time, there's been struggles. And there's been gaps, and there's been families with struggles and gaps. Also during that time, there have been really bright spotlights focused on mental health and focused on making sure there's no disparity between physical health and mental health care, focused on the fact that we don't have the amount of providers, mental health counselors, therapists, providers, psychologists, child psychiatrists that we could possibly have for a population as large as Wisconsin. And so how can we build different parts of the system, be part of the support? And we've had these conversations. A lot of people much smarter than me have had these conversations. So do you have any insight from working from the side of being a parent and from the side of providing that support to parents for longer than those 14 years I have, about why is this gap so persistent? What isn't connecting that could connect, that could make this a better system for families who have children who have mental, behavioral, emotional challenges?
Wow. Well, that's the $64,000 question.
So I know you probably don't have just this one straight answer, but I'm really interested to talk about what is it that what could change that could impact the system for better for the families?
Yeah. It's not that I'm struggling to answer. I'm struggling to figure out where to start because there are so many different aspects to it. I think, well, let me just start with, you're absolutely right. And I think, so I'll go back again, right? I started out with talking about the beginnings of Wisconsin Family Ties. So let me go back 41 years ago. A woman by the name of Jane Nitzer wrote a report called, that was funded by the Children's Defense Fund, called Unclaimed Children. And in that, the foreword to that report called it a depressing report at a depressing time. It was really more than that. It was a searing indictment of our society and our system's failure to meet the mental health needs of children. And so recently I started taking a look back at that report and seeing what was it that it was calling out? And unfortunately, many of those things that report called out 4 decades ago are still issues today, despite us having spent an incredible amount of time, effort, and money on what's been referred to as transforming the system. It's interesting that when we work with families, all families are different. They have their unique things that are important to them, their own unique family culture. And yet there's one common thing that I have found in working with families over the last 20 years, and that's that all of them will say that the system is insufficient to meet the needs of their kids. And so you're absolutely right. There are gaps. There are huge gaps. There are chasms. And in those chasms are an abyss, and we're not. And if you look at it, the thing that I've really struggled with the most recently is that the complaints and concerns that we hear today about the system, about our children's mental health system in Wisconsin, are the same exact things that were said 20 years ago. So what does that tell us? I do think that it tells us a few things. Number one is that there have been many, and I could list those things for you here. The Blue Ribbon Commission in the late 90s. There was in around 2010, I can't remember the name of it, but there was a large and involved process for working to transform the mental health system. So there have been efforts in looking at this. There was a gaps analysis done in 2019, 2020 by the state. In those, it invariably, the things that they focused on were access, availability, and quality. And while those are great things to focus on, it finally struck me that if we focus on those, and we've made lots of advances or lots of investments in those things, and yet we still have the same kids that failed 20 years ago are the same kids that we're failing today. Those aren't the issues. Those are not the issues. And I actually think that the issue is more one of structure than those individual components. You started out today, Tim, talking about borders, the 14 county borders. And that struck me as a parallel to the way that our systems are built. They have distinct borders, and they don't go beyond those borders. And yet kids can't be categorized, right? You can't, it's not like nuts and bolts, they are unique, and they cross all of those borders. And unless we have systems that are that can cut across those borders, those silos, as what they're often referred to, we're going to continue to be stuck in the same kind of systems that we have today. So that's one of the things that we're focusing on. We're trying to focus on how do we take a look at kids who are, in general, for a lack of a better term, and I don't really care for the term, but at risk of poor outcomes from a society's perspective. And how do we address their needs, regardless of where they fall in what system or what they're functionally eligible for, which programs? We know that they have needs, and let's address those needs. Let's address the needs of the family, which we often forget, by the way. Our service systems for children focus on the children. And even though, there's lots of research and social work will tell you that children grow up in the context of a family, we don't spend the same amount of effort in working with the family. And so we need to look at different ways to cut across those kinds of barriers. I think the second thing that we need to do is, in my opinion, we need to reimagine human services. We need a system that provides services and supports of sufficient duration and sufficient intensity to permanently alter the trajectory of our most at-risk youth. We need a system that never forgets the human part of human services. We need a system that's built on deeper understanding of children and families and less judgment, and a system that views relationship as a primary intervention. That's what we need. We need a dramatic mind shift in human services. What we have today, unfortunately, is a system that is populated with good people. I have no doubt that the people who get involved in, that work in any kind of helping service are there for the right reasons. They want to, they got involved because they wanted to help. They are, at their core, compassionate people. And yet, what we find is that there's something about systems, something about institutions that allows or forces or assists these people in acting contrary to their own personal values and judgment. What is that about those systems? And whatever that is, we've got to tear it down. We often see kids that, despite here's one of the ways that that's manifested. We have a fail first mentality. Parents have long been adamant that their child's situation, their condition, shouldn't have to get bad enough before they're eligible for programs and services. And that was actually identified in Jane Nitzer's Unclaimed Children report 40 years ago. Decades later, fail first is baked into all levels of our mental health system. It's baked into the program eligibility, the duration of services, medication. When you're particularly on Medicaid, if your doctor says that medication X is going to be the most effective for your child, but Medicaid says, no, you got to try Medicaid Y first. And we have to see how he or she does on that medication. That should not be a system decision in my book. It should be a decision between families and medical professionals. So, the issue that we have today in many of our systems is that, if you were to take a look at the way our system thinks, not the people within it, but the way our system thinks, is it worse for a child to get a service they may not need? Or is it worse for a child to not get a service they need? And unfortunately, the system today acts as if it's a greater tragedy for a child to get a service they may not need. I reject that entirely. And so we need I'm sorry that this is a long rambling answer, but we need a massive rethinking of these issues. And to me, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to get there? And I came up with, I actually did a presentation on this recently, and my slide says, we need more POP, P-O-P. and that stands for pissed off parents. I'm sorry if that doesn't meet your language criteria, Tim, but I hopefully that's not.
I'm pretty sure in the last 2 years, I have said much worse than that.
Okay, cool.
That is recorded. So you are well within the bounds of whatever might be regulating me at this moment.
All right. So, we need those kinds of parents. We need parents who are going to stand up and speak out regardless of the consequences. We need, there's the famous quote from the movie Network: "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." That's what we need. We need parents who are going to stand up and say those. And I really think that right now we're at a point where it's going to have to be parents. The system has proven to me over the last 2 decades that I've been working with it and kind of in it, it's just incapable of getting out of its own way. We're going to need some external pressure, some external force that is going to have to act to make this actually work for our kids. And I think it can. And oh, by the way, I think, even though I haven't run all the numbers, I'm not an economist, I actually think it's less costly for it to do the right thing rather than to continue to operate the way that it is today.
Okay, I am going to just come in and just so totally agree with you, because it makes absolutely no sense to me that we don't spend the money at the first sign of a dysregulation issue, of the first sign of, hey, this is not developmentally appropriate, mentally, behaviorally, that this child is struggling. If we could pour the resources in to help that child regulate, to help that child figure out what's that jumble going on inside of them, then they're not going to escalate. And if they're not going to escalate, they probably aren't going to need expensive treatments later on, or being sent away to somewhere because they never learned, and the family didn't have, and if the family didn't have access to the, hey, this is what this might look like, and here's how you can support them, and here's the safety that you can put around them. Your comment about waiting for failure first is a very, very expensive philosophy. It waits until the bigger, more expensive resources have to come in to then control a situation, instead of teaching families and children how to take control of their own lives. That I see that, I mean, and that's, you're right, that's not just in mental health care. That's in our special education systems. That's in our medical systems. That's in our Medicaid system. That's in our children's long-term support services. Is the eligibility criteria, the hoops that parents have to go through to receive any sort of assistance. And then sometimes they only receive assistance that they're allowed to receive, not the assistance they need. And the system says, no, we'll give you what you need. You just have to use the right language. You have to tell us what the outcome is going to be for your child and why you need that. It's like everything, the system is stacked against the parents getting the support that they need and that their families need. And I think that's a shame, because in some ways it's a waste of the money.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've often said that the very moment that a mom says something isn't right, I don't know what it is, but something's not right, that ought to be enough to mobilize the system. I mean,
I had one parent say that every diagnosis should come with a social worker.
Yeah, that's an
and she of course said not every diagnosis, but every concern,
yeah,
should come with that social worker.
Yeah, and you're right about the eligibility thing, and I've had this conversation not only in the human services field, but also with DPI. I've had this. When a kid gets referred for special education, the eligibility process has to go through to try to look for ways to see if this kid is eligible for services. And I said, you need to flip your thinking around. Is you need to look for, are there indications that this kid should not be eligible? We should presume eligibility first rather than presume ineligibility, in my mind. Because so what? I'll give you an example. My youngest, he when he was 6 months old, he missed all of his developmental milestones. And it was pretty terrifying. He didn't coo, he didn't roll over, didn't get up on his knees. Fortunately for us, we had an older son on the autism spectrum. And so we knew what to do. And so by the time our son was 8 months old, he was getting birth to 3 services. He's getting physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, which I still, to this day, 20 years later, don't understand how you do speech therapy with an 8-month-old, but they did it. And so when he turned 3, he was evaluated for special education services. And at the time, he qualified. So he was given an IEP. He turned 3 at the end of July, and something happened between the end of July and the beginning of school where it was like somebody flipped a switch. At the time he was 3, he had a large vocabulary, but he was not a whole lot of novel sentence creation. It was more clipped phrases that he heard from videos or things that his mom or I would say, and he'd repeat those. He used them appropriately, but he just didn't have a lot of novel sentence creation. But somewhere in that, like, 5 to 6 weeks in between the time he was evaluated and the time school started, the switch was flipped and he started talking, and he didn't shut up for several years after that, I might add. So, and I like to think that, he should be a poster child for early intervention, because he got into birth to 3 very early. And, look, it took a while for everything to click, but it did click. And so by the time he actually entered early childhood, he didn't really need to be there, right? If they had looked at eligibility then, he wouldn't have been in there. But the school decided that, oh, guess what? He's a pretty good role model for the rest of the kids that are in there. And so he stayed in early childhood for that first year, and they did not dismiss him from that. So, I mean, there's an example where somebody actually took it upon themselves to not, follow the letter of the law, but follow the intent of the law. And the fact of the matter is, he benefited from that. He benefited from that social interaction. He benefited from learning the things that all of those kids learned there. He benefited from the fact that he got to meet other kids who had differences, right? That they were different than the neurotypical kids that he was going to meet later on. So all of those things, I think, are benefits to kids. So yeah, I agree. And the other part of that whole eligibility part that really frustrates me is this focus on assessment as part of that eligibility process. And if we take a look, I would almost guarantee you that the kids who people say end up having poor long-term outcomes, again, I hate thinking of that, but the ones that would fall into that grouping, however you define it, if you were to go back to their case folders, I guarantee you, you're going to find assessments almost inches thick. Those assessments are obviously not doing something to produce better outcomes. I am not anti-assessment. I'm not anti-research at all, but we really need to take a realistic view. In my opinion, we need to take a realistic view at the value of those. I think that there's much more value in spending less time on those standardized tools and more time really deeply understanding who this child is and what he or she needs.
Okay, so I was about to put in the chat, less tools, more relationships.
Yep.
To try to sum that up, but so yeah, Hugh, this is my frustration level with some things is pretty much where your frustration level things are. So that's why we were having this conversation today. But without declaring ourselves kings of the world and having the power of fiat and saying this is the way that it will be, what do you have some steps? Have you thought about some small steps or big steps that these pop people can begin to initiate? Because I really like what you said about the system is full of good people.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to meet a social worker that does not have a compassionate, empathetic heart. Yeah. But the system changes them. I have yet to meet a family that has only one problem. If they have a child who has an issue, whatever that issue may be, chances are there's other things going on, and we don't see that coordination of care. So given that it's the system itself, which is a behemoth and grows larger every time we feed it money without insisting on proper outcomes, I'll maybe erase that a little bit later in here so I don't get fired. What can we do? What can we do besides being pissed off? What about those people that are tired of being pissed off and want to do something?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have to admit that I'm still trying to figure all of that out. I wish I had a really, the quick, pithy answer to that question, but
I appreciate the fact that you don't, because I think the problem is so embedded.
Yeah.
And it's so big that I don't think quick, pithy is going to do it.
Yeah.
But we need a starting point.
So here's our starting point at Wisconsin Family Ties. So we have developed something that we're just now starting to implement that we call SPARC, SPARC, Strategic Parent Advocacy Readiness Continuum. And what that is seeking to do is for the families that we are working with, we're trying to identify as objectively as we possibly can when they move from this state of conscious self-advocacy, which is where most of them start out or are near that, right? They recognize that there's something that they need some assistance with, and they're trying to find some assistance to help them through this particular issue. And we're trying to identify those who are starting to make that journey to being able to understand that, hey, this thing that happened to me, that shouldn't happen to anyone. To me, that's a different step, right? You've gone from this, I don't like what's happening to me. Now, this shouldn't happen to anyone else. Then you go to this, start to get to systemic thinking. Why is this happening to everybody? Why is this happening? And then you get to systemic action, which is, what can I do about it? Can I talk to my legislators? Can I, participate in some advocacy group? So that's what we're starting to do. That's one step. One of the other things is we did some research in 2 years ago. We started did some research on advisory committees. So the way that parents were adamant that our voice needed to be listened to. We're the parents are the experts on their kids, and that's what we should be. That's the attitude that should be there. I love what Dr. Ross Green says. He says, when it comes to kids with challenging behavior, the only experts are those who have one. So when this family movement in children's mental health started, which was in the 80s, about the time that we were formed, that movement pushed for parents to be at the table, and we were invited to participate on advisory committees. Unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that advisory committees, even though I still sit on many of them, they're designed to make you feel empowered, but to keep you powerless. Control still rests with the convening authority. They're the ones who make the decisions. We can advise all we want, but the system, if the system is really oriented towards the status quo, which I believe they are, the recommendations coming out of those are not going to move the needle enough. And so we took that research. Now we have a report that we did that it found that advisory committees are ineffective in eliciting, prioritizing, and promoting family voice. And so we think we're kind of trying to use that to educate parents and inviting them to contact us to become part of a group of parents to start moving these systems to the degree that they need to be moved in order to effectively serve our families.
Any information, if you can send me after this is done, like a link to that report where people can find out more and then find out more about how they can get involved, because that's always been a feeling that families have had.
Yeah.
But we work within a system that our feelings in reality, our experience in reality doesn't really matter unless somebody has studied it and said that what we believe and what we know is true. And then other people listen to it. It drives me absolutely nuts. And I work in a very academic setting. I work in a research center. I get it. I get research. I understand. But it's usually years and years behind a family's reality.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The other thing that I would love to see happen, although this is probably the biggest challenge, is there are a number of kind of family-run agencies in our state, and yet we can't really work together collaboratively as much as we would like, because we're all competing for limited kinds of funds. I think maybe the first step is for all of them to come together and collaborate for more funding for these kinds of organizations. But I also think that there's an opportunity to look at mergers. There is power in numbers, and I think that if we had boards of those nonprofits that were willing to come together and really have some discussions and find out where commonality exists, we might see that there's some things that could be done to create a more powerful entity in terms of fighting for these changes that we know need to happen in order for our kids and families to have good outcomes.
Well, this is a sort of conversation I kind of wanted. I don't have any idea why I was in the mood for this conversation today, but I was. And I thank you that you're available. But I would be totally remiss and a horrible host, so to speak, if I didn't ask if there was any other questions or comments from the people that have joined us here today. Please feel free to disagree with us. I know I disagree with Hugh before. Hugh disagrees with me. We're okay with that. We're adults. We understand that not everybody is going to have our point of view and our experiences. But that doesn't mean that we lose respect for each other. No, we continue to respect. So please, if you have a different point of view, raise your hand. We will gladly listen to it. Feel free to put it in chat. If you have an agreement, if you have a story that backs up what we're saying, feel free, or if you just don't want to say anything right now because this is a pretty deep, dang conversation that we're having. I totally understand that as well. But I believe we need to have more of these conversations and that look at the problem, but also what are the steps that we can take. And I love that you found funding to prove what parents know. It still drives me nuts that it has to happen, but we're still very far away from asking the community what they would like to have proved and what their questions are. We're still being directed by people that are 5, 6 steps removed from the experience.
Yeah. So let me just add one other thing. So, we use, I don't have a research background at all, but I do love research. And I think that we can use that to support the things that we inherently know. And so, I think one of the big things that's come out in the last decade or so is all of the research on social determinants of health. Yeah. And a lot of that research done right here in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute.
Yeah.
And just to sum it up, what it essentially has found is that the social determinants of health have roughly twice the influence on overall health outcomes that clinical services do. Mm-hmm. And yet our systems still heavily prioritize clinical services over all of these other things that we know produce better, have a bigger impact on health outcomes. And so, every time I get a chance, I try to hammer that kind of research and just say, we need to realign our funding with the research on social determinants of health. Yeah. And, I think if we just had a lot of people continuing to push that and push that with their legislators and push that with state agencies, eventually things, if you repeat things often enough, I think that eventually they start to take hold. That's one strategy when you don't have the power yourself. You just continue, you have a consistent message and you repeat it every chance that you get. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do is continuously hammer on the research on social determinants of health.
Well, and you have many allies in that.
Yeah.
Throughout the nation and in Wisconsin in maternal and child health and in other sort of organizations such as that. So I am not seeing anything pop up in the chat, not seeing any hands raised. So I'm going to assume that we have numbed them with our dialogue that we have held. So we'll see how many views this gets, but I'm probably going to go back and listen to it because I really want. This matters to families. Getting this, if we could get this right, if we could get the system to be responsive to and listen to the needs of the family, the system will save a lot of money in the back end. It would work so much better. Families would be healthier, children would be healthier, schools would be safer, organizations would be better equipped for inclusion and for diversity. It's a win-win, win-win, win-win-win. But it's not
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it immensely. And of course, thank you for the work you're continuing to do for Wisconsin families through Family Ties. And hopefully we can have another conversation in the future, maybe in 6 months, when we look back and say, hey, we had this conversation. Look what happened.
That would be great, Tim. I'd love to do that. Thanks so much for letting me spout off, and and thanks for everything that you do as well. I'm in awe of the work that you do, and so thanks for letting me come on and have a chat with you.
Well, that is so reciprocated with the work that you do. So thank you so much. The Mutual Affection Society is now ended. We will close this out. Thank you all very much. I totally spaced putting the evaluation in the chat again, so I'll be sending that out to the people who did register and who showed up. So thank you all for being here. Hugh, thank you again. Have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.